task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Report. Content warning. Report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Teaching inaccurate history. Researchers and historians have raised significant concerns that the American K-12 education system is failing to teach a complete and accurate history of slavery and structural racism, with the significant role that African Americans had in developing this nation's wealth without compensation. David Yakavone, at Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African American Research, who has been studying United States history textbooks published from 1839 to the 1980s, found that many textbooks taught that white people were superior to black people and downplayed, minimized, justified slavery based on a racial caste system, with African Americans appearing only as a problem. 76 Dr. Yakavone explained that in the older history textbooks, white supremacy is a toxin injected of many generations of Americans. 377. Addition, a 2018 study, Teaching Hard History, American Slavery, surveyed social studies teachers in K-12 schools across the country and found that 97% agreed that learning about slavery is essential, but that there is a lack of deep coverage on the topic. 58% reported dissatisfaction with their textbooks, and 39% reported their state offered little or no support for teaching about slavery. 378. The study gave an average score of 46% with respect to whether 10 popular U.S. history textbooks provide comprehensive coverage of slavery and enslaved people. Also found 8% of 1,000 American high school seniors surveyed could identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. 179. To ensure that schools accurately teach American history, Dr. Yakavone recommends teaching the truth about slavery as a central institution in America's origins, as the cause of the Civil War, and about its legacy that still lives on. 380. Texas, the state that uses the largest amount of textbooks, thereby shaping the K-12 textbook industry, the Board of Education, rather than historians, began changing the history books to refer to formerly enslaved people as workers. 81. In schools, students of color, including black students, are less likely to see books with characters that share their cultural background and textbooks that reflect their experiences. 182. Many educators recognize that textbooks do not accurately and fully reflect experiences of people of color. Only 1 in 5 educators, the vast majority of whom were white, in a June 2020 nationwide survey thought so. 183. Educators of color were more likely to find textbooks lacking. 84. In 2020, Connecticut became the first state in the nation to require high schools to offer African American, Black, Puerto Rican, and Latino studies. 85. Continued opposition to discussing the truth about slavery in public K-12 schools. Republicans in multiple states and in Congress have introduced bills to cut funding from schools that choose to use curriculum derived from the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 series of essays challenging readers to think about slavery as foundational to the nation's origin story. Inclusion of this history delegitimizes the idea of the U.S. as a nation founded on principles of liberty and freedom and creates racial divisions. 386. In addition, concept that schools may be teaching students critical race theory, which explains that race as a social construct embedded in legal systems and policies, is under attack across the nation by groups that say it divides Americans and places the blame on white Americans for historical harm to African Americans and other non-white Americans. 387. But Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, one of the nation's largest teaching unions, said that teaching critical race theory is really about teaching the truth, and pledged to defend any teacher who gets in trouble for teaching honest history. Teaching the truth is not radical or wrong. Distorting history and threatening educators for teaching the truth is what is truly radical and wrong. 388. Weingarten. He stated that those attacking critical race theory have other motives, labeling any discussion of race, racism, or discrimination as critical race theory to try to make it toxic, and to deprive students of a robust understanding of our common history. 389. As important as how schools shape their curriculum concerning the history of black people in America is how schools teach the humanity of black people before, during, and after enslavement. Curriculum that undoes the harmful narratives of African Americans that have historically been used to justify false conceptions of black inferiority, requires schools to teach that African American stories did not begin with enslavement. 90. Such a curriculum also requires schools to teach about humanity's origins in Africa thousands of years before either Arabs or Europeans encountered people of West and Central African ancestry. 91. Academics have also focused on the importance of teaching about the study of African lives and the African experience for true liberation. 392. In order to empower black communities through the study of black history. Academics discuss the importance of challenging European perspectives of the African experience to prevent others from defining the African experience and to give African people control over the narrative that is told about their experiences. 193. Redefinition of school curriculum discussing black experiences, including the narrative about the African experience, is particularly important in California, a state which, as of 2015, was home to the fifth largest black population in the country. 394. Inscribed in school textbooks causes miseducation and effectively contributes to African Americans' cultural and social alienation from identity. Existential belonging. 395. In the 1960s, W. E. B. Du Bois spoke out about the dangers posed by the deficiencies in school curriculums with regard to black history and culture. 196. He warned that the intentional omission of these concepts from public school curriculums would ultimately cause black history and culture to be lost. Black families and organizations actively and systematically impress these fundamental principles upon subsequent generations of African Americans. 397. In line with this same notion of education for liberation and cultural preservation, the activists specifically focus their efforts on the establishment and expansion of Black studies on university and college campuses to further the ongoing movement for the liberation of African Americans. The majority of Black studies programs began at predominantly white institutions and a handful of HBCUs. 398. Although the Black studies movement was initially faced with stiff opposition, by 1971 an estimated 500 courses and programs had been organized in the United States. 399. California student groups have long raised concerns that the complete history of racism and segregation in the state and across the nation has been left out of textbooks. From diverse backgrounds who helped create this nation and California are not reflected. 400 inches. It isn't just white heroes like Christopher Columbus or folks like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. More history behind it, and we don't learn a lot about the other important figures that contributed to making America into what it is. Alvin Lee, President A Generation Up, a 4,000-member California student organization. With legislators considering how to change California's history textbooks to better reflect the contributions of its diverse people. A legislator who has advocated to ensure that California's elementary and secondary schools teach a curriculum that reflects the history of African Americans and other people of color, explained that of our history plays a critical role in showing who we become, and students are more engaged when they see themselves reflected in the coursework. 401. Among other things, California's approach to teaching about slavery has been critiqued. In 2018, a classroom teacher made headlines for staging a classroom simulation of conditions on a slave ship to provide a unique learning experience. 102. A study by Southern Poverty Law Center found that California did a better job than other states in teaching slavery, but highlighted concerns with the approach of teaching about Harriet Tubman in second grade 2 years before slavery is taught, and 8% of American high school seniors identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. To discuss how false ideas of white economic and political supremacy fueled and perpetuated slavery as an institution. 403. Research has shown that because school curricula often do not include content that reflects the experience, culture, and history of Black students, they and other students whose experience, culture, and history is not reflected, suffer. 104. When Black students do not see their experiences and history reflected in the school curricula, this leads to a feeling that they are not important and even invisible and voiceless in the classroom. 105. And while culturally responsive teacher training is one way to help Black students and other students of color feel welcomed, included, and valued in schools, preparation is inadequate in training teachers to be culturally responsive and to carry those practices into the classroom in both the way they teach and the materials they use when they teach. 406. Another way to increase diversity in curriculum is by adding ethnic studies courses. Ethnic studies is a term used to encompass Black, Chicano, Latino, Native, and Asian American studies, and was developed in response to lack of representation of people from these groups in curricula taught in U.S. colleges and universities. Generally, ethnic studies is not taught in California elementary and secondary schools, despite known academic performance and attendance benefits. 107 in 2016-17, only a small number -17,354 K-12 students statewide were enrolled in ethnic studies courses. 408. One reason for this: only 51% of the 777 ethnic studies courses in social science in 201,617 were approved as meeting AG state university admissions requirements. 109. This may be changing. In 2016, California state law mandated creation of a voluntary K-12 ethnic studies curriculum. On March 18, 2021, the State Board of Education approved the Model Ethnic Studies curriculum. 10. And while in 2019, a California bill to mandate ethnic studies in all K-12 schools was vetoed by Governor Newsom, 411 in October 2021, he signed a different bill. Bill 101, which will require California high school students to take ethnic studies as a graduation requirement commencing in 2030. 12. In the interim, several districts have recently made completion of a course in ethnic studies a graduation requirement, including Montebello, Sacramento City, and Coachella. 413. In 2020, San Francisco approved development of a K-12 Black Studies curriculum. 414. In California's public colleges and universities, the movement for ethnic studies began in 1968. At that time, the Black Student Union, the Third World Liberation Front, select faculty and staff, and other activists from the larger San Francisco Bay Area organized and led a series of protests at San Francisco State University. 15 protesters denounced the deficiencies within the university's curriculum, which neglected and misrepresented the experiences of people of color, including African Americans and indigenous people. 416. On a mission to define and shape their own educational experiences, students drafted a list of demands for the university and protested for months until a deal was negotiated. The university agreed to establish a College of Ethnic Studies, the first in the nation, with classes geared toward communities of color. 417. Since that time, 22 of 23 CSU campuses have maintained some level of ethnic studies, but a recent legislative analysis suggested that 53% of CSU students had not taken a course between 2015 to 2018. 418. August 2020, Governor Newsom signed Assembly Bill 1460, which, beginning in 2024 to 2025, requires a 3-credit ethnic studies course for graduation from a CSU, the first change to the SHU's general education curriculum in over 40 years. 19 legislative findings in support of the bill's passage included that white students and students of color benefit from taking ethnic studies courses, which play an important role in building an inclusive multicultural democracy. 120. In discussing the importance of the bill's passage, Senator Stephen Bradford, the bill's co-author, commented, "Ethnic studies is critical in learning our contributions to America and telling the true story of our rich history." 121. Conclusion. Slavery era. Enslaving states denied Black enslaved Americans an education so that they could maintain control over the enslaved people they depended upon to build this nation's wealth. An understanding of how powerful knowledge can be emboldened enslaved African Americans to find ways to educate themselves, despite the great danger risked in doing so. Following the Civil War, states adopted many laws and policies continue denying education to free African Americans and to effectively maintain an illiterate servant class. Where Black children were permitted to attend segregated schools, white-controlled legislatures severely underfunded these schools and subjected Black students to deplorable conditions. Aside from the inferior quality of these schools, Black communities also suffered from the ongoing racist attacks by white terrorist groups who committed themselves to destroying Black schools. The Supreme Court outlawed school segregation in its 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. White policymakers and school boards adopted other policies to ensure the continued exclusion of Black students from their schools. Such policies and the incidents and effects of enslavement continue to have lasting effects on the educational opportunities and the quality of academic opportunities available to African Americans today. 422. Acts have denied the vast majority of African Americans continued access to education and high-quality and well-funded schools from enslavement until the present. They have suffered a number of harms, including lower levels of high school graduation, achievement, access and completion. These injuries widened the gap between black and white wealth in America. COVID-19 pandemic has made the education injuries even worse, because far more black students than white students live in poverty, and students living in poverty have had less access to the technology needed to participate in remote schooling. 123 California and the nation have not adequately accounted for the harmful intergenerational effects of education discrimination and denial. Years, the academic gap between all student groups has steadily narrowed, except for the gap between black and white students, which has widened, confirming the ongoing existence of deeply rooted racial disparities in the nation's education system. 424 in California. Over the past decade, average math and test scores rose for all student groups, except black students. Where there was the least significant gap between the academic achievements of different student groups, data showed that this could be attributed to less socioeconomic inequality among students, more spending per pupil by the district, disparities in access to experienced teachers. 425 The gap also continues to exist in high school graduation rates, but it has reduced considerably nationwide and in California since the 1960s. 426 Nonetheless, the gap in college as well as graduate school admission and graduation rates has remained stagnant, with African Americans half as likely as white Americans to have a college degree. 427. Intergenerational denials of equal educational opportunity. African Americans have also been denied a number of other benefits, including a positive link between one's own education and the education received by one's children. 28 More schooling is associated with higher earnings in one's own life and in subsequent generations. 29 However, white and African Americans with the same educational level do not have the same level of wealth. 130 White college graduates have 7 times more wealth than their black college graduate counterparts, even when it is assumed that the white and black college graduates are in jobs making the same amount of money. 431 African American college graduates also have 2/3 of the net worth of white Americans who never finished high school. 132 And black college graduates continue to suffer higher unemployment rates than white college graduates. 33 Centuries after slavery, white Americans continue to benefit from its effects, and African Americans continue to suffer its compounded harms.